Let's make our own sensory muff. So for people with dementia or Alzheimer's, it can be very hard for them to kind of sit still. And one idea for this is to create some sort of fiddle toy or fiddle accessory or a muff so that they have something while they're sitting. They won't be like picking at themselves. They can play around with all the different styles and textures. So I found all of these different fabrics that I had and I started basically cutting them into strips. And I've had a couple pieces that were very specific for my grandfather. So for example, this US Army, since he was in the Army for over 30 years, this is going to be the base of my cuddle muff. And then I started to attach my different textures onto that fabric. So I had some crocheted fat quarters, I had some knitted scarves, and what I was going to do was basically just attach them to the cotton fabric itself. And then I cut out some of the army fabric as I'm going to overlay it with a fleece material that I had. Basically, the idea for this is that you want to have as many different textures, as many different feelings as possible. So it's going to be cotton, there's going to be fleece, the crochet, the knit. I got some of my old ropes that actually came from graduation. I'm going to add those on it. And then I also had this polyester material. Once I had it all laid out, I started pinning the different pieces to the fabric so that I would know where to sew so I could sew them into place. So just here's a close-up. What I'm going to do is basically sew along the outline of that fat quarter, sew along the rope, and then for that polyester material, I'm going to be sewing it with the right sides together to the army cotton, and I'll do the same for the fleece and the other army piece of fabric, and then begin to kind of put the process of putting these all together. So now that I have more of them together, what I can start to do is really build out that first layer of my muff, or the outside of it. So with right sides together, I'm going to pin two of these pieces and then just take a seam all the way along so that I can have one full piece with all those little pieces connected. So now that's complete, I'm able to start working on the inside of the muff. So I have all these different textures and different yarns, different ribbons. I even had like a little hook. Some of these yarns actually kind of expand. I have some ruffles, shiny pieces of fabric, and now it's going to be the exact same process that I did on the front, pinning all the smaller pieces together and then sewing them onto their fabric pieces themselves. And then I will work on combining all of those fabric layers together so that I could have one large piece that I'll be able to use for the lining of my muff. So all of those individual small pieces are now connected to some sort of fabric. So now what it's time to do is sew each of those fabric squares together. And the way I'm going to do this is very similar to before, pinning everything with right sides together to its matching component. And then I will take a seam and then I'll keep repeating this process until I have the full panel completed. So this is what my completed panel looks like. You can see all the different colors. I still have one more piece of fabric to add. You can see there are like a couple little mistakes just because some of this fabric is slippery. That just gives something, in my opinion, that you can kind of play around with your hands. So I'm not going to take it out and try to smooth out the seam. So I'm just going to take that final seam. So I'm going to pin this all up and then sew it across. So now that I have my two layers complete, what I can do is pair them with right sides together and put them down, and then I'm actually going to be sewing these together. First though, since this is going to be a muff, I decided to give it some sort of weighted element, so I added some batting. I ended up at first cutting out 3 pieces of batting, but this was a little too much, so I would recommend doing only 2 pieces of batting, and then you have your outside layer and your inside layer, but you'll have those with right sides together, and then you'll have those 2 pieces of lining and you'll pin them all up. Now that I had the batting all cut out, what I started to do was work on the cuff shape of my sensory cuff. So the way I did this was I folded my fabric for the top layer. I folded in half so that it formed a tube, and then I pinned all the way down that one side and took a seam. I repeated this for the lining, which was attached to the batting. So I did the exact same process for that, pinning it all the way down the side and then taking a seam. So now it's time to combine all the muff parts together essentially. So as you can see, I have one layer with the right side out, and I'm going to combine these with right sides together and then pin around one edge of the tube. What you'll see is I did at first make a mistake and I pinned both sides, and I was going to take a seam on both ends and just leave a hole. I do not recommend doing this as it doesn't turn out exactly as you would hope. So once you have that one edge complete, what you're going to do is turn this right side out, which is actually very easy since you only have the one edge that you have to worry about. And then you're able to see that this is what your muff will eventually look like. And now we have just this one raw edge at the bottom. So the way I'm going to do this is actually just fold it in on itself and then take a top stitch all the way around. This is also another reason why you probably only want to use 2 layers of batting, just because it would be very, very thick for you to sew all the way around. But once you have it all pinned, you're just going to take that final seam. So here's what my muff looks like. It is basically all done. You could stop at this part if you wanted to, but I decided to add some buttons as well as some ribbon just to give him something else that he could play with while he was using the muff. For the ribbon, I just tied it on, and then the buttons, I just did a hand seam to put them in the different places. I also spelled out his name, Pop-Up, using the buttons that I had. He loved it, and he was so excited to get it and has been using it, I believe, almost every night. And if you like this video and you'd like to see more, be sure to like and subscribe.